What's the most karate technique you can think of? You're probably going to say one of three things. The karate chop, for obvious reasons, the side kick, or the X block. Now the karate chop and the side kick we've talked about a lot on this channel. But what exactly is the X block? Is this something you can really use, or is it just something that exists in the dojo? In this video, I'm going to talk about the X block and how it's useful in the dojo, how it's useful for real fighting, and how it might be the most useful tool for self-defense. Now the X block has a ton of uses in traditional martial arts. More often than not, someone will throw the aforementioned karate chop, either with a knife or empty-handed at you, and you'll shoot up an X block to stop them in their tracks and then follow up with some kind of counter. The idea is you're going to create an impenetrable wall between you and your opponent. You have one arm supporting the other arm, so it really doesn't matter what your opponent throws at you, they're not going to break through this barrier. It's a pretty foolproof way to defend yourself. But the problem with this kind of blocking is that the exact same thing that makes it good at defending you also exposes you to get the crap beat out of you. Because by committing both hands to one block, I'm completely opening up my body. So while this block works in theory, in practice, there's a lot of holes. But there's a movement happening right now in the karate circle, which argues that blocks aren't really blocks. Instead, they're saying that things like the X block are not meant to be stopping a strike, but are meant to be capturing a moment in time where you are simultaneously defending and setting up for an attack. Which is why my favorite way to practice the X block in any variation comes from the Filipino martial arts hubad, which essentially is just a flow drill where you work on blocking, passing, and controlling your opponent's strike, or knife stab if you want to do it that way. So if we reduce the definition of the X block to any time you cross your hands over each other, then that's what you're doing constantly in hubad, stopping a strike with one hand and then passing it through with the other by using the X block. That's how to use it in motion. Now, there's plenty of problems with this version of training on its own, but that's a whole different can of worms. We're not talking about that today. What I'm saying is, if you think about a block as only being this, that's the only way you're gonna apply it. Not to interrupt the video, but I wanna talk to you guys about something. I was going over my analytics the other day, and I noticed that only 4% of my audience is actually subscribed to the channel, and only 2% of that 4% had notifications turned on. Guys, I really love producing content for this channel, and I love interacting with all of you, but the best way to help the channel grow is to make sure you're subscribed and you have your notifications turned on. So if you haven't already done so, please, please, please go ahead and do that. Don't worry, I'll wait. Now, I say that, but at the same time, we gotta talk about a big elephant in the room. That's being the element of bunkai. For those of you that don't know, bunkai is the act of taking stuff from kata, like the X block, and finding out how you can apply it in a real fight. It's a very fun and engaging process, but the truth is, I think it's kind of not real. Earlier I said if we broaden the definition of the X block to just mean any time you cross your hands in front of each other, then that can mean, yes, you're blocking a strike, but can also mean you're setting up for a front choke or you're trying to throw someone to the ground or whatever. If you look at it that broadly, then anytime I'm doing this idly, I'm practicing chokes, I'm practicing throws, I'm practicing kicks, whatever. Now look, I'm not trying to insult anybody. If you feel like bunkai adds value to your training, great, because the fact is, so do I. But we can't argue that it's the fastest way to teach someone how to fight. In fact, the truth is, it's probably one of the slowest ways to teach someone how to fight. And yes, there is some kind of value in just shutting up and doing what your instructor says, but that's also because usually you can kind of put together what the movement is doing. Going to combat sports, all of the movement pretty much makes sense immediately. Whether we're talking about throwing punches, throwing kicks, going for sweeps, going for takedowns, whatever. Even if you're not good at it or you can't understand how to do it, everybody's pretty capable of visualizing how a technique is supposed to work in combat sports because its application is the point. It's not the practice that matters, it's the ability to pull it off in real time. However, with most traditional martial arts, it's reversed. It's the practice that's important and the application may or may not matter. What you're doing is finding justifications for certain practices rather than finding reasons for practices. But with that out of the way, let's talk about practical bunkai. No, not Ian Abernathy's channel, which is fantastic and you should check it out, but bunkai that actually represents the techniques you're practicing. The way I like to do the X block is by moving to the inside of the strike, I can cross my arms in front of my opponent and then unload a vicious back or hammer fist to their face or to their shoulder, depending on what context we're in. But the most successful use that I've found using the X block is in a variation of the Muay Thai long guard. Now, for those of you who don't know, the long guard is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You're taking your hands and casting them out as long as possible to create a guard between you and your opponent. You're either here eating punches on your forearms or resting your hands in front of their hand so they can't punch around you. A variation of that is as the punches come in, your rear hand crosses behind your lead hand. You can do this for a whole bunch of reasons. The reason that I'm most comfortable with is that I just get lazy. Holding my arms up like this eventually gets pretty tiring, but by crossing one on top of the other, I can kind of rest on my stronger side. The other side of that coin is by putting this elbow in front of my face, I now have more guard in front of my face. This is not how I'm going to stand for the entire fight. But if I'm dealing with an opponent who's constantly throwing straight punches at my face, I might mix up my long guard to keep him from breaking through my defense. What you do long guard, you can also do close guard. Now, I'm not saying you should stand in this tight cross guard like this that you see in a lot of anime and kung fu movies, but I am saying that while you're not throwing strikes or you're not having strikes thrown at you, feel free to move from stance to stance. You see a lot of movement like this in styles like 52 blocks and capoeira, and while this isn't super effective all the time, in the moments between strikes, between exchanges, shifting back and forth like this can create an impenetrable wall where your opponent can't find a window to strike. And essentially what you're doing is moving from X block to X block. And on the topic of straight punches, if you don't want to just use the long guard to interrupt punches, you can always do the tried and true brush block, which is so prevalent in Kenpo and Filipino martial arts. And what is the brush block if not just creating an X block? Now, moving on from the world of striking, earlier I mentioned that in bunkai training, people say the X block is meant to signify a choke or a throw. And while I don't necessarily think they know that when they're training, I'm not saying they're wrong. Because the same way you move explosively into the X block is how you want to move into someone's collars before you pull them into a two-hand choke. Same token, the way you push someone's head down as though you were going to slam them down to the ground is the same way you do a low X block. So even though I have my problems with bunkai style training, I'm not saying what they were saying is wrong. Here's where I think the X block is most useful. Because really, we've been talking about using the X block in consensual violence, in hand-to-hand combat with an opponent who knows he's fighting. But I don't really think that's the way it's meant to be used. If you're a fan of Tony Blauer, you're probably aware of what's called the flinch response. But if you're not, let me sum it up. Essentially, if something happens towards your face, your natural instinct is to bring your hands up to protect you. And in Tony Blauer's spear training, the goal is to weaponize that flinch so that you're not just freaking out, but you're actually turning it into a way to defend yourself. And as you may have just noticed, as my hands instinctively came up, they came up in the shape of an X. This is why I think the X block is so prevalent in traditional martial arts. I think it's a very, very regimented way of training the flinch response. Because if this is what you do naturally when something comes towards your face, then it only behooves you to know how to fight from this position. A lot of times in the combat sports world, we talk about things where the fight has already started, where I'm already locked up with my opponent trying to find ways to hit him. But the fact of the matter is, if you're concerned with self-defense, you can't only address that situation. You need to mostly be paying attention to the moments right before the fight starts, when you're not quite being assaulted yet. Because that's the moment that really dictates, are you gonna get to go home or not? Anyway, you guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you learned something. If you did, please make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and apparently turn on notifications because not a lot of you are doing that. If you're looking to support the channel, go ahead and open up the description box down there at the bottom. There you'll find a whole bunch of links and codes to pick up combat self-defense gear, as well as new gloves, shin guards, whatever you're looking for. It's down there in the comment section. All that being said, you guys, this has been Rob from Combat Self-Defense. I want to thank you for all the hard work. Thank you for the hard work yet to be done, and I'll see you next time. Boom!